Also in Colorado, incumbent Secretary of State Jena Griswold, who went unopposed in her Democratic primary, will face off against Republican Pam Anderson in November's general election. Anderson, who believes the 2020 election was conducted securely and fairly, won her primary over two challengers, including Tina Peters, who was indicted in March by a grand jury on multiple charges related to a breach in her county's election system in the last presidential election. For more, I'm joined by Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. Not many people would have really thought about what someone in your position typically does until recently. I mean, now you have your counterpart in Georgia at the center of a potential criminal lawsuit involving former President Trump. That's Secretary Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. He found himself in an increasingly common predicament, which is, how do you convince constituents that your office has overseen free, fair, and transparent elections?
Well, first off, thank you for having me on. And that's a big question of our time. We're seeing the big lie used to fuel the insurrection. It's now used to push voter suppression, destabilize American elections, and erode confidence so that the next January 6th is easier. And secretaries of state and election workers need to remain committed to the truth, to pushing back on the lies. And it's important to continually message out, like in a state like Colorado, that there's bipartisan oversight over every aspect of the actual election. And one of the things I'm really proud of is we just launched a digital initiative with my predecessor, who I ran against in 2018. So it's a bipartisan message assuring Colorado voters that our elections are safe and secure. And with that said, we saw over 98% of voters during our primary continue to use their mail ballots.
That's a really interesting dynamic, and important to have that kind of bipartisan buy-in, really. I mean, as you mentioned, the January 6th hearings, they have given Americans a real chance to hear about this pressure campaign from high-level Trump associates on a number of state officials. From your vantage point, what kind of backstops are in place to safeguard this process, or does it really just depend on the person in that position?
Well, it's both. And we are seeing from the January 6th hearings that a lot depends on good actors, people who will uphold their duty to the Constitution and the law. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is really the radicalization of the far right and the embracement of these conspiracies. We're seeing people who are charged with administering elections become security risks themselves because they're trying to prove conspiracies. So that's why you have to double down on the effort to strengthen laws. For example, Tina Peters, who was in the Republican primary and lost last night, she's charged for compromising her own voting equipment. She's a local county clerk who decided to become a security risk. So we acted very quickly. I decertified voting equipment. She is under indictment right now. But on top of that, I ran the first legislation in the nation, making it a felony to allow unauthorized access to voting equipment and to really get at those insider threats. So local government, state government, the federal government needs to do everything possible right now to safeguard democracy, but prosecutors also need to act. There needs to be disincentives. And what voters can do is make sure that these big lie candidates do not get elected to oversee our nation's elections in 2022.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little more about Peters and kind of the dynamics going on in Colorado, because as you mentioned, Peters faces criminal charges for tampering with voting equipment. I mean, of course, she was roundly rejected last night by voters in Colorado. So now you're set to square off against Pam Anderson. But she says that she's looking to look into alleged election fraud. Do you know what potential fraud she's referring to?
Well, Tina Peters' loss, I think, last night, and a lot of the election deniers' loss in Colorado is really a victory for the Colorado election model. We have vote by mail for all, weeks of early voting, and same-day voter registration, and Coloradans affirm their belief in our system and the use of that system. With that said, to your point, Pam Anderson did pander to the extreme right in her primary. She has also flip-flopped on things like automatic voter registration, which I led into law and set up, and that registered 250,000 people in the middle of the pandemic. She also failed to support our landmark voting rights legislation in 2019 that increased drop boxes in our security. So overall, I think, we are seeing from Republican candidates a rejection of modernism, of moderation that we really need in Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, I'm proud to always protect every Republican, Democrat, and independent voter, and that's what I will continue to do. I'm also proud of my record of increasing access to the right to vote and making sure Colorado maintains our gold standard in election security.
Well, I do want to ask a little bit more about that because we've seen a lot of Republican-led states passing restrictions after the 2020 election. They're kind of putting it under this banner of election integrity. But are there any election law changes that you would like to see? Is there anything that you should be doing differently?
Well, we can always innovate. That's why I led the largest democracy reform in the nation in 2019. Increased drop boxes by 65%, partnered with the tribes. We saw an approximate increase in tribal voting in 3 years of 20%. That's also why I just led the nation's first piece of legislation on insider threats, passed legislation to protect election workers. It is now a crime to dox or retaliate against election workers, and led legislation to prohibit open carry within 100 feet of voting. So yes, we can always innovate, but lies and disinformation, pushing out lies about alleged mass fraud to try to win a primary further spreads the big lie. And again, the big lie is dangerous. It's leading to threats against election workers. It's destabilizing American elections. And it's being used to lay the groundwork for the next January 6th. So democracy in so many states this election is literally on the ballot. We are seeing big lie candidates run to be the chief election officers in states across this nation. And voters will have a big task. And I am so optimistic because I know American voters are going to save democracy come November 2022.
Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.